Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. Usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision.
Right, yeah. You want it to be clear-cut.
Exactly. I mean, if you break your arm, the x-ray shows this jagged white line. The doctor points to it, and that's it. It's clean. It's totally visible.
It's comforting because it's binary. We inherently want our problems to be easily categorized so you can just apply a straightforward fix.
Yeah, but then you step into the world of human behavior or morality or spiritual health, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just completely useless.
Oh, absolutely useless.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
Yeah.
And that is exactly the landscape we are walking into today. We're taking a massive deep dive into the final 10 chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 19 through 28.
It's a heavy section for sure.
It really is. And our mission here is to act as your thoughtful guides through it all. We want to help you extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and, the real-life application from this ancient text. We aren't just looking at history here.
No, not at all.
We're looking at a mirror held up to the human condition.
And to really understand what we're looking at in that mirror, we have to grasp the geographical and psychological shift that's happening right at the start of chapter 19.
Right, because the scenery changes pretty drastically.
It does. Up until this point, Jesus has largely been in Galilee. It's his home turf. It's rural, agricultural, relatively safe, I guess you could say. But here, the narrative pivots sharply.
He starts heading south, right?
Yeah. He leaves Galilee, crosses over the Jordan, moves through Perea, and sets his face toward Jerusalem. And this isn't just a change of scenery.
Right. It's highly intentional.
Exactly. He is intentionally walking toward the religious and political epicenter during the Passover feast, which was essentially a massive powder keg of Jewish nationalism and Roman military presence.
And he knows he's walking into a trap. I mean, he explicitly tells his disciples that this journey ends in his execution.
Yeah, he doesn't sugarcoat it.
And you can really feel that tension in the text because time is running out, the pleasantries just vanish, the teachings become intensely focused on what it actually means to participate in the kingdom of heaven.
And he starts doing that by completely upending society's rules.
Okay, let's unpack this. The very first challenge he faces on this road is a trap set by the religious leaders, the Pharisees, regarding divorce.
Right.
They come up and ask him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason?
Which, sounds like a theological hypothetical to us today, but it was actually a deeply malicious political trap.
How so?
Well, historical records from that era show a fierce, highly polarized societal debate. The Jewish rabbinic establishment was split into two main camps. You had the school of Hillel, which essentially argued that a man could divorce his wife for almost any offense. I mean, if she burned his dinner, or if he simply found another woman more attractive, he could write her a certificate of divorce.
Wow, so it's just this staggering level of male privilege.
Exactly.
I mean, that's basically treating a spouse like disposable property. If you're bored, you just throw her out on the street.
And in a patriarchal first-century economy, a discarded woman had virtually no economic rights. She would be left utterly destitute, often forced into begging or prostitution just to survive.
That's horrifying. So what was the other camp saying?
On the other side of the debate was the stricter school of Shammai, which maintained that divorce was only lawful in cases of severe moral failure, like adultery. So the Pharisees are trying to corner Jesus.
Right, like a catch-22.
Exactly. If he sides with Shammai, he alienates the masses who enjoy the lax rules of Hillel. But if he sides with Hillel, he looks like a moral compromiser.
But Jesus refuses to play their game, which is so typical of him in these encounters.
Yeah, he completely bypasses their contemporary legal loopholes. He doesn't quote either rabbi. He goes all the way back to the Genesis creation account, to the original sacred design of unity.
Right. He asks them if they've read that the Creator made them male and female, and that the two shall become one flesh.
And then he argues that Moses only permitted divorce as a temporary concession because of the hardness of their hearts.
The hardness of their hearts. That's a crucial phrase, isn't it?
It really is. He's diagnosing a human pathology. He's saying the law they are so proud of debating wasn't the divine ideal at all. It was a damage control mechanism for human brokenness.
And we have to look at this with, wisdom and discernment. to separate the enduring spiritual truth from the ancient cultural setting.
Absolutely.
The enduring wisdom is the profound sacred nature of the marriage commitment. The idea that you don't just sever a one-flesh union without massive collateral damage.
Yeah, it's not meant to be casual.
But practically speaking, in that specific moment, he was taking a massive stand for the vulnerable. He was actively dismantling a system of male privilege that allowed men to legally abandon women on a whim.
Right. He turned a dry theological debate into a defense of the marginalized.
Which is incredibly disruptive to the power structures of his day.
Oh, massively disruptive. And that disruption continues almost immediately with another encounter that tackles a different kind of deeply entrenched power wealth.
Yes, the rich young ruler. So we see this young, wealthy man run up to Jesus, kneel down, and ask, "Good teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life?"
And Jesus starts by listing the commandments that deal with human relationships. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, honor your parents, and love your neighbor as yourself.
And the young man confidently replies, "I've done all that from my youth. What do I still lack?"
He's checking the boxes.
Right. But then Jesus hits him with a devastating response. He says, "If you want to be perfect, go. Sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me."
It's a heavy demand.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate for a second here.
Go for it.
This guy is a model citizen. He hasn't hurt anyone. He honors his family. He's followed the rules. Why is Jesus suddenly moving the goalposts and demanding he liquidate his entire estate? I mean, it feels almost antagonistic to someone who is just trying to be good.
Well, it only feels like moving the goalposts if we think Jesus is operating a behavioral checklist.
Right.
But he's not looking at the man's resume, he's diagnosing his heart. Commentaries on this passage point out that the young man came short because of an inordinate love of the world.
So it's not about the money itself.
No, Jesus isn't inherently anti-wealth, but he is intensely anti-idolatry. He targets the very thing this specific man relies on for his ultimate security and identity.
It's a precision strike on his ego, basically.
Yeah.
If you look at this psychologically, wealth isn't just about having nice things. Wealth provides an illusion of absolute control. It insulates you from vulnerability.
Yeah, it builds a wall.
Right. If you're rich, you don't have to depend on the goodwill of your neighbors or the mercy of the universe. You can just buy your way out of discomfort.
Precisely. The young man is asking what he can do to acquire eternal life, treating it like another asset he can purchase or earn through moral performance.
Like adding it to his portfolio.
Exactly. But Jesus is telling him that the kingdom of heaven requires radical surrender, not a transaction. And the text says the man walks away grieving because his possessions effectively possessed him. He couldn't let go of the control.
And as he walks away, Jesus turns to his disciples and drops a metaphor that is still an enormous obstacle to spiritual growth today.
The camel.
Yeah. He says, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into God's kingdom."
Which is such a striking image. And, we live in a society that equates wealth with blessing, success, and divine favor. If you have money, you are winning at life.
Oh, absolutely. The hustle culture.
Right. But Jesus entirely inverts that paradigm. He frames wealth as a profound spiritual hazard. The image of the camel and the needle is a brilliant piece of ancient hyperbole denoting an absolute impossibility without divine intervention.
So he's saying it's hard for a rich person to be saved because they have so many layers of false security to break through before they ever feel a genuine need for grace.
Exactly. Which perfectly sets up his next major teaching, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. This is the ultimate breakdown of human merit.
Oh, I struggle with this parable so much. So Jesus tells a story about a landowner who goes out at 6 a.m. to hire workers for his vineyard. They agree on a standard daily wage of denarius.
A standard, totally fair wage.
Right. Then the landowner goes back out at 9 a.m., noon, and 3 p.m., hiring more people each time. Finally, at 5 p.m., with just 1 hour left in the workday, he finds some guys standing around and hires them too.
Then comes the moment of payment.
Yeah. And the landowner instructs his foreman to pay the workers, starting with the last ones hired. The 5 p.m. workers step up, and to everyone's shock, they are handed a full denarius.
A whole day's wage for 1 hour of work.
See, if I am the 6 a.m. worker, I am mentally doing the math.
Oh, of course.
I'm thinking, if he gave them a denarius for 1 hour, I've been grinding in the scorching heat for 12 hours, about to get a massive bonus.
It's just human nature to assume that.
But then the 6 a.m. guys step up, and the landowner hands them Exactly, 1 denarius. I don't care how spiritual you are, that feels viscerally unfair.
It does.
If I work a 12-hour day at a startup, carrying the whole project, and my coworker rolls in for the last hour, and the CEO gives us the exact same equity payout, I am furious.
Okay.
I mean, I'm quitting on the spot.
And that anger is exactly what Jesus is trying to provoke.
Wait, really? He wants us to be mad?
Well, he wants to expose why we're mad. It offends our deeply ingrained sense of transactional fairness. We operate on a system of merit, I do X, I deserve Y.
Right, quid pro quo.
Exactly. But Jesus is deliberately dismantling transactional religion. The workers who labored all day represent the religious establishment, or really anyone who feels they have earned God's favor through their long obedience and moral track record.
And the 5 p.m. workers?
They represent the marginalized, the late converts, the outcasts who have absolutely nothing to offer but their presence at the final hour.
And the landowner actually addresses the angry 6 a.m. worker, right? He says, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go. Is your eye evil? Because I'm good."
Right. The landowner's pointing out that their anger isn't born of injustice. I mean, they received exactly what they were promised.
Yeah, they got the contract rate.
Right. Their anger is born of envy. They resent the landowner's generosity to someone they deem undeserving. This parable is the pure mechanics of grace. God is a debtor to no one.
Wow.
The reward of the kingdom isn't a wage you earn. It is a gift freely given out of the sheer goodness of the giver. As Jesus concludes the parable, the last shall be first and the first last.
But the disciples just cannot wrap their minds around this non-transactional kingdom. I mean, literally, right after Jesus predicts his horrific death for the 3rd time, the mother of James and John approaches him.
Oh, this scene is so telling.
She kneels down and asks for her sons to sit on thrones at his right and left in his kingdom. She's aggressively lobbying for the VP spots in the new administration.
The timing is just staggering. It reveals a massive disconnect. Jesus is talking about his impending execution, his ultimate sacrifice, and they are maneuvering for political promotions.
They're building their resumes.
Exactly. They still think the kingdom of heaven is going to look like the Roman Empire, just with different people in charge.
So Jesus has to pull them all together and totally redefine power for them. He says, look, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Their great ones exercise authority over them. They use their power to dominate, to extract, to elevate themselves.
That's the worldly model.
Right. But then he says, it shall not be so among you. Whoever desires to become great among you shall be your servant.
He is establishing servant leadership not just as a nice moral suggestion, but as the fundamental operating system of his community. Power is not for domination. It is for service.
And he points to himself as the ultimate example, saying the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many.
Which is a complete paradigm shift.
It is. And if we translate that into our modern lives, we have to look at the arenas where we hold any kind of power or influence. Our marriages, our workplaces, our friendships, our parenting.
Right. Anywhere we have leverage.
Because the constant human default is to use whatever leverage we have to demand service. We want our preferences prioritized. We want the easiest tasks. We want the credit.
Always.
So the radical challenge here is to identify where we are demanding to be served and consciously choose to flip that dynamic. How do we leverage our resources to elevate the people around us instead of ourselves?
And, you can't preach an upside-down kingdom like that, where the last are first, where power is service, where wealth is a danger, and expect the establishment to just smile and nod.
No, they're not going to like that at all.
Not at all. If Jesus really wants to challenge these deeply entrenched power structures, he has to take this message to the seat of power itself. He has to go to Jerusalem.
Which brings us to the triumphal entry. Jesus finally arrives at the capital, but it's a massive paradox.
How so?
Well, he's being hailed as a conquering king. The massive Passover crowds are cutting down palm branches, laying their cloaks on the road, shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David."
The classic royal welcome.
Right. But he isn't riding a war horse. He isn't leading an army. He's riding on a humble donkey, the foal of a beast of burden. It's like an anti-triumph.
Yeah, it's basically a piece of street theater mocking the pomp and militarism of a Roman parade.
And the very first thing he does when he gets inside the city walls tells you everything you need to know about his mission. He doesn't go to the Roman fortress to challenge Pilate.
No, he goes straight to the temple.
The center of his own religious heritage. And he starts flipping tables, driving out the buyers and sellers, and overturning the seats of those selling doves.
He is furious.
Yeah, but why is he so furious? I mean, If people need animals for sacrifices and they need the right currency to pay the temple tax, aren't these merchants just providing a necessary religious service?
Well, to understand his fury, you have to understand the specific economics and geography of the temple at that time. The temple tax could only be paid in a specific currency, the Tyrian shekel, because it didn't bear the image of the Roman emperor.
Okay, so you couldn't use normal Roman coins.
Right. So pilgrims coming from all over the known world had to exchange their money, and the money changers were charging exorbitant exchange rates.
So they were price gouging.
Exactly. Furthermore, the selling of doves, which was the specific sacrifice required of the poorest people who couldn't afford a lamb, was heavily monopolized and marked up. They were economically exploiting the most vulnerable worshipers.
So it's a racket operating under the guise of piety.
Yeah, exactly. But there's also a spatial element to this that people miss. All of this chaotic, noisy, smelly commercial activity was taking place in the court of the Gentiles.
Which was what exactly?
The temple complex was divided into zones of increasing exclusivity. The court of the Gentiles was the outermost area, and crucially, it was the only place where non-Jews were permitted to come and pray to the God of Israel.
Oh, wow.
So the religious elite had essentially decided that the spiritual access of foreigners was less important than their own commercial convenience. They crowded the Gentiles out.
So when Jesus quotes the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, yelling, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers," he isn't just upset about a few messy tables.
No, not at all.
He is violently defending the space meant for authentic, inclusive connection with God. He is dismantling a system that uses religion to extract wealth and exclude the outsider.
And the narrative drives this point home with a really bizarre, almost jarring incident the very next morning.
The fig tree.
Yes. Jesus is walking back into the city. He's hungry, and he sees a fig tree covered in leaves. He goes up to it expecting fruit, finds nothing but leaves, and curses the tree, saying, "Let no fruit grow on you ever again."
And the tree just immediately withers, which seems so out of character for him. Why is he using his divine power to kill a piece of flora just because he's hungry?
Well, it's an enacted parable. In the prophetic tradition of the Hebrew Bible, the fig tree was a common symbol for the nation of Israel, specifically its leadership.
Okay.
A fig tree with lush leaves gives the distinct promise that there is fruit underneath. By cursing it, Jesus is providing a living illustration of what he just witnessed in the temple.
So the leaves are like the outward appearance of religion.
Yes. The religious establishment of Jerusalem has all the leaves, the massive architecture, the intricate rituals, the beautiful vestments, the right vocabulary. But when you look closely, there is absolutely no fruit of justice, mercy, or true worship. It is entirely performative.
And he connects this withered tree directly to the parable of the two sons. A father tells his two sons to go work in the vineyard. The first son bluntly refuses. He says, "I will not." But later, he regrets it and goes to work.
Right.
The second son gives the perfectly polite, compliant answer. "I go, sir." But he never actually shows up. So Jesus looks at the chief priests and elders and asks, which of the two did the will of his father?
And they are forced to admit it's the first son.
Right. What's fascinating here is that Jesus then delivers a line that must have hit them like a physical blow. He says, "Assuredly, I say to you that tax collectors and harlots enter the kingdom of God before you."
You cannot overstate how offensive that would be to a first-century religious leader. Tax collectors were viewed as literal traitors, extorting their own people for the Roman occupation. Prostitutes were the ultimate symbol of moral degradation.
But Jesus' logic is ironclad.
What's fascinating here is that those public, messy sinners are the first son. They initially rebelled openly against God, but when they heard the message of repentance, they actually changed their lives. They bore fruit.
And the religious leaders are the second son.
Exactly. They say all the right theological things, they wear the right clothes, they look incredibly holy, but their yes is hollow. They refuse to recognize their own need for repentance. They have leaves, but no fruit.
Authenticity versus performance. And it all comes to a boiling point in chapter 23, where Jesus unleashes the 7 woes. This is arguably the most blistering, relentless critique of religious hypocrisy in all of ancient literature.
It really is.
He calls the scribes and Pharisees blind guides, fools, and whitewashed tombs.
And the specific hypocrisies he targets are deeply revealing about human nature. He says they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers.
They love the prestige, but none of the actual work.
Right. They love the best seats at feasts and the respectful greetings in the marketplaces. They do all their works just to be seen by men. And he specifically points out their phylacteries.
Wait, what exactly was a phylactery?
A phylactery was a small leather box containing tiny scrolls of scripture. Devout Jewish men would strap them to their foreheads and arms during prayer, literally following the command in Deuteronomy to bind God's words on their bodies.
Okay, so it was a standard practice.
Yes, but Jesus points out that these leaders were making their phylacteries exceptionally broad and the fringes of their garments extra long.
So it's a physical signaling of virtue. It's the ancient equivalent of carrying around a massive, heavily highlighted Bible so everyone knows how much you study.
Precisely.
Or today, it makes me think of perfectly curated social media. We can so easily fall into this trap of performative morality. We post the right inspirational quotes, we share the infographics about justice, we curate an image of profound empathy and enlightenment online.
While in our private, untelevised lives, we might be deeply uncharitable to our own families.
Exactly. Or completely ignore the suffering of our actual neighbors.
Jesus drills down into that exact dissonance. He points out that they meticulously tithe their tiny kitchen spices, mint, dill, and cumin. They are obsessively measuring out 10% of their spice racks to give to the temple, ensuring they follow the absolute minutiae of the law.
Which is just wild to think about.
But at the same time, they have completely neglected the weightier matters: justice, mercy, and faith. They are majoring in the minors while the entire foundation rots.
And the metaphor he uses for this is haunting. He calls them whitewashed tombs. On the outside, they are painted beautiful and white, gleaming in the sun, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness.
It's a profound image of internal decay masked by external curation. Now, we must apply careful historical discernment here.
Right.
Because for centuries, these harsh critiques in chapter 23 have been tragically and violently misused to fuel anti-Semitism, painting all Jewish people with this brush of hypocrisy.
Which is a horrific misreading of the text.
Yes, we have to understand the context. Jesus is a Jewish rabbi speaking to Jewish crowds, utilizing a long-established tradition of internal Jewish prophetic critique.
He's doing what the prophets always did.
Exactly. He is acting exactly like the prophet Jeremiah or Amos, critiquing the institutional corruption of the ruling elite. This is not a condemnation of a race. It is a timeless, devastating warning for any religious, political, or corporate leader in any era who uses an institution to elevate their own status while crushing the vulnerable.
And then if the ultimate danger is doing our good works just to be seen by an audience, the antidote has to be the deliberate removal of that audience.
How do you mean?
Well, the real test of our character isn't what we advocate for online, It's what we do when absolutely no one is watching. Doing a significant act of generosity or service entirely in secret, where we receive zero social credit, zero validation, is the only way to kill the ego's demand for applause.
That's a powerful practice. And having completely dismantled the false security of this performative religious establishment, Jesus then shifts his focus from the present corruption to the impending future.
The Olivet Discourse.
Yes. As they leave the temple complex, his disciples, clearly still impressed by the sheer architectural majesty of the place, start pointing out the massive stones and beautiful buildings to him.
They're acting like tourists in their own capital. Look at the size of these stones.
And Jesus just stops them cold and says, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down."
The disciples must have been utterly stunned. I mean, the temple was the center of their universe. It seemed as permanent as the mountains.
So later, as they sit privately on the Mount of Olives looking across the valley at the city, they ask him, "When will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?"
And this question sparks chapter 24. And it is arguably one of the most intense apocalyptic sections of the entire Bible. He talks about wars, famines, earthquakes, the sun being darkened, and the stars falling from heaven.
It's very heavy imagery.
So how much of this is literal and how much is metaphor?
It is what theologians often call a dual prophecy. He is using the language of cosmic collapse to describe an impending historical catastrophe, while simultaneously pointing toward the ultimate end of human history.
The impending historical catastrophe being?
The reality of his warning about the temple came to pass with horrifying literalness in 70 AD, just a generation after he spoke these words.
The Roman siege of Jerusalem.
Yes. The Jewish people rebelled against Roman occupation, and the Roman Empire responded with overwhelming apocalyptic violence. 4 legions under the command of Titus surrounded the city.
It was brutal, right?
Beyond brutal. Historical accounts from witnesses like Josephus detail a siege of unimaginable horror. Famine swept through the city to the point of cannibalism. Factions inside the walls slaughtered each other.
Oh my gosh.
When the Romans finally breached the walls, the slaughter was so immense that blood reportedly extinguished the fires in some of the buildings. Over 1 million people perished.
Then what happened to the temple itself?
The Romans intentionally burned it to the ground, melting the gold into the cracks of those massive stones. Then they ordered their soldiers to literally pry every single stone apart to retrieve the gold. Not one stone was left upon another.
Wow. It's chilling. Jesus is looking at these beautiful buildings, and he can see the absolute devastation coming because he knows the trajectory of their nationalistic pride and rebellion against the empire.
Exactly. And he tells his followers that when they see the signs of this coming war, they shouldn't try to defend the city. They should flee to the mountains. And historical records suggest that the early Christian community actually did heed this warning and escaped to a town called Pella before the siege closed in.
But he doesn't just stop at the historical destruction of Jerusalem. He seamlessly weaves that impending localized judgment into a broader warning about the final judgment of the entire world.
And his primary message isn't to give them a decoded timeline so they can calculate the date. His primary message is constant, vigilant preparedness.
Right. And he illustrates this preparedness with a series of parables in chapter 25. First, the parable of the 10 virgins.
Let's hear it.
So there's a wedding feast, and 10 bridesmaids are waiting for the bridegroom to arrive to join the procession. 5 are wise and bring extra oil for their lamps. 5 are foolish and only bring what's in their lamps.
And the bridegroom is delayed, right?
Exactly, until midnight. When the shout goes out that he's arriving, the foolish virgins realize their lamps are going out. They beg the wise ones for oil, but the wise ones say, no, there might not be enough for us and you. Go buy your own.
And while they're gone,
the bridegroom arrives, the doors are shut, and they are locked out in the dark.
In the ancient Near Eastern wedding customs, the arrival of the bridegroom could be highly unpredictable, hence the need for extra oil.
So what does the oil represent?
The oil represents the internal, irreplaceable spiritual life of the individual faith, character, endurance. The chilling reality of this parable is that when the crisis moment arrives, you cannot borrow someone else's character.
You can't just coast on someone else's preparation.
Exactly. You cannot ride on the coattails of your parents' faith or your spouse's devotion. You either possess the internal resources to meet the moment or you don't.
And the demand for readiness escalates in the next story, the parable of the talents. A wealthy master is going on a long journey. He calls 3 of his servants and entrusts them with his property.
Right.
To one, he gives 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability.
And we have to pause on the word talent.
Okay.
In modern English, we use it to mean a natural skill, like playing the piano. But in the ancient world, a talent was a massive unit of weight, usually of silver or gold. A single talent was roughly equivalent to 20 years of wages for a common laborer.
Wait, 20 years?
Yes. It is an astronomical sum. The master is handing over millions of dollars to his servants to manage while he's gone.
Okay, that changes the stakes significantly. So the guy with 5 talents immediately goes to work, trades, and doubles his money to 10. The guy with 2 doubles his to 4.
Good returns.
But the servant who received 1 talent goes out, digs a hole in the ground, and hides his master's money. When the master finally returns to settle accounts, he praises the first 2 enthusiastically.
Well done, good and faithful servant.
Right, but the confrontation with the third servant is jarring. The servant approaches and says, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. And I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground.
And the master just completely explodes.
He does. He calls him a wicked and lazy servant, takes the talent away, and orders him thrown into the outer darkness. Now, I really struggle with this master.
Why is that?
If I'm listening to this in the 21st century, I'm thinking, isn't the master just acting like a ruthless, hyper-capitalist hedge fund manager? The third servant didn't steal the money. He didn't blow it in Vegas. He preserved the capital in a zero-risk way. Why is he punished so severely for just being careful?
That's a common reaction, but in the economy of the kingdom, hoarding out of fear is not a neutral act. It is a profound violation of trust.
How so?
Theologically, the talents represent whatever resources we've been given, our time, our wealth, our influence, and the truth of the gospel itself. The tragedy of the one-talent man isn't a lack of business acumen. His failure was rooted in his deeply distorted view of the master.
Oh, because he called him a hard man.
Exactly. He viewed the master as a tyrant who only wanted to extract value, rather than a generous lord inviting him into a shared enterprise. His fear paralyzed him. He chose the false safety of burying his potential, rather than taking the relational risk of investing it in the world.
God expects a return on the life he has given us. That completely shifts how we view apathy.
It really does.
We often think of sin as doing bad things, sins of commission. But this parable suggests that one of the greatest dangers is omission, doing absolutely nothing because we are too afraid to risk what we've been given. We bury our resources in the ground of our own comfort.
And that concept of the sin of omission becomes the absolute focal point in the terrifying final scene of chapter 25, the judgment of the nations, often called the sheep and the goats.
Right. Jesus depicts the Son of Man coming in his glory, sitting on his throne with all the nations gathered before him. He separates them into two groups, like a shepherd separating sheep from goats.
And the criteria for this ultimate separation is shocking. He doesn't administer a theology exam. He doesn't ask how often they attended the synagogue or whether they aligned with Hillel or Shammai.
No, he looks at the righteous on his right and says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me.
And the righteous are genuinely baffled. They don't remember ever encountering the glorious king of the universe in a soup kitchen or a jail cell.
They ask, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you?
And the king delivers what might be the most paradigm-shifting sentence in the entire New Testament. Assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me.
He radically, inextricably identifies his own divine presence with the most vulnerable, marginalized, and suffering people on the planet.
It is a staggering claim about the nature of God. We look for the divine in the majestic and the powerful and the beautiful. Jesus locates his presence in the destitute, the immigrant, the sick, and the incarcerated. If you want to encounter God, you have to go to the margins.
And the judgment falls heavily on the group on the left, the goats. He tells them to depart into the eternal fire. Why? Not because they actively oppressed the poor, but simply because they did nothing.
Sins of omission again.
I was hungry and you gave me no food, sick and in prison and you did not visit me. They ignored the suffering that was right in front of them. Their apathy was their damnation.
If we connect this to broader human wisdom, many philosophical traditions understand that a society's true moral character is revealed by how it treats its most vulnerable members. But Jesus pushes it past sociology into eternity.
Your spiritual state is intrinsically tied to how you treat the person who can do absolutely nothing for you in return.
It demands that we look at our daily routines and ask, who are the invisible people in my life? The unhoused person on the commute, the difficult coworker, the isolated neighbor. Ignoring them isn't just rude, according to this text. It is ignoring the presence of the divine.
Having delivered his final, heaviest teachings on how we are to live, wait, and invest our lives, Jesus now steps out of the role of teacher and into the narrative itself. He's about to demonstrate the ultimate example of his own teachings. This takes us into chapters 26 and 27, crucible of suffering, surrender, and love.
The narrative pacing slows down considerably here, becoming incredibly intimate before the violence breaks out. It begins in the town of Bethany at the house of Simon the leper.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Jesus is reclining at the table, and a woman approaches him with an alabaster flask of exceptionally expensive, fragrant oil. She breaks the flask and pours the ointment over his head.
The text notes that this oil was worth nearly a year's wages. It is an act of overwhelming, extravagant devotion. But immediately, the room turns hostile. The disciples, and the Gospel of John specifically identifies Judas Iscariot as the ringleader here, are indignant.
All right, they complain.
They say, why this waste? For this fragrant oil might have been sold for much and given to the poor.
It's a fascinating dynamic because on the surface, Judas sounds exactly like Jesus did in the previous chapter.
Right. Jesus just spent hours talking about feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. You would think he would agree that liquidating this asset for poverty relief was the responsible moral choice.
But Jesus strongly defends the woman. He tells them to leave her alone. He says, "She has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, but me you do not have always. In pouring this fragrant oil on my body, she did it for my burial."
Why does Jesus choose this moment of extravagance over the utilitarian argument for the poor?
Because Judas's argument isn't born of genuine compassion for the poor. It is born of cold, calculating utility and, as the text hints, secret greed.
He didn't actually care about the poor.
Right. Judas views the oil entirely as a commodity to be monetized. He views Jesus as a political project. The woman, however, understands the moment. She senses the impending shadow of death that the male disciples are still aggressively denying.
She sees what's coming.
Yes. Jesus is validating her act as a pure expression of raw, beautiful worship. In a world obsessed with productivity and pragmatic efficiency, there is a profound place for extravagant, inefficient love, especially in the face of suffering and death.
It's the ultimate contrast. And it's immediately after this display of pure devotion that Judas slips away, goes to the chief priests, and asks the most chilling question in the narrative. "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?"
And they count out 30 pieces of silver.
The price of a slave. He sells out the Son of God for the equivalent of a few months' pay.
The betrayal is set in motion. They share the Last Supper, where Jesus institutes the communion meal, breaking bread and sharing wine to symbolize his impending broken body and shed blood. And then, late at night, they retreat to a garden called Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives.
And it is here in Gethsemane that we see the humanity of Jesus in its most agonizing, vulnerable state. He takes Peter, James, and John deeper into the garden, and he begins to be sorrowful and deeply distressed.
He tells them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me."
He walks a little farther, falls on his face, and prays.
The medical and psychological weight of this moment cannot be overstated. Another gospel account mentions him sweating drops like blood, a rare clinical condition called hematidrosis.
Hematidrosis, that only happens under extreme stress, right?
Exactly. Extreme, life-threatening physiological and emotional stress. The Greek word used for his distress implies a feeling of being completely surrounded by terror, a crushing, suffocating weight. He is staring directly into the abyss of the physical torture, the betrayal of his closest friends, and the unimaginable cosmic horror of bearing the sins of humanity and facing the wrath of God.
We often talk about surrender in very light therapeutic terms today. We say things like, just let it go, or surrender it to the universe.
Right, like it's easy.
But Gethsemane isn't a peaceful meditation retreat. It's not a gentle trust fall. It is more akin to a patient sitting in a bleak, fluorescent-lit waiting room, knowing they're about to undergo a brutal, agonizing round of chemotherapy that will strip them of their strength and dignity, but knowing it is the only path to life.
That is an apt metaphor. He prays, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." The cup is an Old Testament metaphor for divine judgment and suffering.
He doesn't want to do it.
No, he is asking with every fiber of his human survival instinct for another way. But he anchors that desperate plea in radical, agonizing submission, not as I will, but as you will.
It challenges our entire modern operating system. Our culture is built on the premise of optimizing comfort and eliminating pain. We invent life hacks to bypass suffering. We want control at all costs.
Absolutely.
But Gethsemane demands that we face the harsh reality that some cups cannot pass. Some suffering cannot be bypassed. It must be walked through. The path to redemption, whether on a cosmic scale or in our own personal griefs, often requires us to hold our honest, desperate distress in one hand and a radical surrender of our autonomy in the other.
He prays this 3 times, returning to find his closest disciples asleep, unable to stay awake with him even for an hour, and then the darkness fully descends. Judas arrives with a heavily armed mob from the chief priests.
And Judas identifies Jesus with a kiss.
The ultimate subversion of a symbol of affection into a weapon of betrayal.
They seize him. Peter tries to fight back with a sword, but Jesus stops him, submitting to the arrest. And then the text delivers one of the saddest sentences in the gospel. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled.
The men who had spent 3 years with him, who had sworn just hours earlier that they would die with him, scatter into the night to save themselves.
Jesus is subjected to a completely illegal nighttime trial before Caiaphas, the high priest, and the Sanhedrin. They bring in false witnesses whose testimonies don't align.
Finally, Caiaphas places him under oath and demands to know if he is the Christ, the Son of God.
When Jesus affirms it, Quoting the prophet Daniel about the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, they tear their clothes, declare it blasphemy, and condemn him to death. They spit in his face and beat him.
And outside in the courtyard, we see the tragic unraveling of Peter. He is recognized by servant girls as one of Jesus' followers.
Paralyzed by fear, he denies it 3 times, finally cursing and swearing, "I do not know the man." Then the rooster crows, just as Jesus had predicted.
Peter remembers the words, goes out, and weeps bitterly. The psychological contrast between Jesus' surrender in the garden and Peter's self-preservation in the courtyard is stark.
Because the Jewish leaders did not have the legal authority under Roman occupation to carry out capital punishment, they drag him to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, as soon as morning breaks.
They changed their charge from religious blasphemy to political treason, claiming he is setting himself up as a king against Caesar.
Pilate is a fascinating, tragic figure here. He interrogates Jesus and clearly sees right through the religious leaders' motives. The text explicitly notes that Pilate knew they had handed him over out of sheer envy. He knows Jesus isn't a military threat to Rome.
But Pilate is a pragmatist, and his primary directive from Rome is to maintain the Pax Romana, keep the peace, prevent riots, collect the taxes.
And a riot is brewing.
Yes. The chief priests stir up the crowd to demand the release of a notorious rebel named Barabbas and demand the crucifixion of Jesus. Pilate is faced with a choice between moral justice and political convenience.
And he chooses convenience. He literally takes a basin of water and washes his hands in front of the multitude, declaring, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person you see to it."
It is the ultimate act of bureaucratic cowardice.
You cannot wash your hands of a systemic injustice that you have the power to stop.
Exactly. So Pilate releases Barabbas, orders Jesus to be severely scourged with a Roman whip designed to rip flesh from the bone, and hands him over to be crucified. We have to strip away the sanitized, gilded crosses of modern jewelry to understand what is happening here.
Right.
Roman crucifixion was not just a method of execution. It was a carefully engineered instrument of state terror, psychological warfare, and absolute public humiliation.
It was designed to maximize pain and prolong death for as long as possible. The victim was stripped naked, nailed through the wrists and ankles to rough wood, and hoisted up along a public road.
Every breath required pushing up on the nailed feet, scraping a shredded back against the wood just to inflate the lungs.
It was an agonizing, slow suffocation that could last for days, and it was reserved for the lowest of the low slaves, pirates, and political rebels.
It was Rome's way of saying, this is what happens when you challenge our sovereignty. Jesus is mocked by the soldiers, crowned with thorns, and led out to Golgotha, the place of a skull.
As he hangs there, the religious leaders walk by mocking him, saying, "He saved others. Himself he cannot save. If he is the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe him."
The irony is profound. It was precisely because he would not save himself that he could save others. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness covers the whole land. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cries out with a loud voice, quoting Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
This is the absolute nadir of his suffering.
It is not just physical torture. It is cosmic abandonment. The perfect communion he had shared with the Father for eternity is fractured as he bears the weight of human sin. He experiences the total isolation of hell on that cross. And then, crying out again with a loud voice, he yields up his spirit.
And the gospel records that the moment he dies, the earth quakes, rocks are split, and most significantly, the massive veil of the temple is torn in two, from top to bottom.
That detail is theologically explosive.
I'll talk about that veil.
The veil was a massive, incredibly thick curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies in the temple. The Holy of Holies was the epicenter of God's presence on earth, and only the high priest could enter it, and only once a year with the blood of a sacrifice.
There was a barrier.
Exactly. The physical barrier communicating that sinful humanity cannot casually approach a holy God.
But it tears from top to bottom, indicating it was an act of God, not man.
Yes. It symbolizes that the sacrificial system is finished. The barrier has been violently removed by the death of the Son. The access to the divine presence is now ripped wide open for everyone. Gentile, Jew, male, female, saint, and sinner.
They take his body down, wrap it in a clean linen cloth, and lay it in a new tomb hewn out of rock owned by Joseph of Arimathea. They roll a massive stone against the door.
The religious leaders, remembering Jesus' predictions that he would rise after 3 days, demand that Pilate post a guard and seal the tomb to prevent the disciples from stealing the body.
It is the final, paranoid attempt of the establishment to maintain control.
And that brings us to the dawn of the third day and the most pivotal moment in human history. Chapter 28. The darkness of Friday is not the end of the story.
The ultimate surrender in Gethsemane and on the cross leads to the ultimate victory over death itself. It's Sunday morning. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary come to see the tomb. Suddenly, there is a severe earthquake.
An angel of the Lord descends from heaven, casually rolls back the massive stone, and sits on it.
His appearance is like lightning. The heavily armed, battle-hardened Roman guards are so terrified that they shake and become like dead men. They literally pass out from the sheer supernatural shock.
The angel speaks to the women and says, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said."
Come, see the place where the Lord lay, and go quickly and tell his disciples.
We have to pause and look at who is receiving this commission. The very first witnesses to the resurrection are women.
Why is that so significant?
It is a detail of massive historical and theological significance. In the first century patriarchal culture of both the Roman and Jewish worlds, the testimony of a woman was considered legally unreliable. They were not permitted to testify in a court of law.
Wow.
So if you were fabricating a myth in the ancient world and wanted people to believe it, you would absolutely never invent a story where women were the primary witnesses.
Right. The fact that all four Gospels emphasize the women at the empty tomb is a profound marker of historical authenticity. It is too culturally embarrassing to have been made up.
But beyond the historical apologetic, it is the ultimate crowning vindication of the upside-down kingdom Jesus had been teaching since chapter 19. The marginalized, the overlooked, the people with no legal standing. They are the ones entrusted with the greatest, most world-altering news in the history of the cosmos.
The last have truly become first.
As the women run with fear and great joy to bring the news to the disciples, Jesus himself suddenly meets them on the path. He greets them. They fall to the ground, take hold of his feet, and worship him.
He tells them not to be afraid and to tell his brothers to go to Galilee, where they will see him. So the 11 remaining disciples make the trek back to Galilee, back to the mountain Jesus had appointed for them.
When they see him, the text says they worshipped him, but it also includes a remarkably honest phrase. But some doubted. Even standing in the presence of the resurrected Christ, human frailty, confusion, and hesitation are still present.
I love that detail. It makes the text so human. He doesn't rebuke them for their lingering doubt. Instead, he approaches them and issues his final enduring mandate, what we now call the Great Commission. He says, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth."
The claim is absolute. He is not just a resurrected rabbi. He is asserting sovereign authority over the entire cosmos. And based on that staggering authority, he gives them their mission.
"Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you."
It's a breathtakingly expansive vision. For centuries, the covenant was largely confined to the ethnic nation of Israel. Now, the doors are blown completely off the hinges. The mission is global, all nations.
But notice the specific verb he uses. He doesn't tell them to go make converts. He commands them to make disciples. What is the profound difference there?
A convert is someone who merely changes their mind, agrees to a new set of intellectual propositions, or joins a new social group. It can be a very shallow, momentary transaction. Yeah. A disciple, however, is an apprentice. In the ancient world, to be a disciple meant to attach yourself to a master, to mimic their lifestyle, to internalize their worldview, and to practice their habits until you began to look and act like them.
So making disciples means the agonizingly slow, messy work of life-on-life mentorship.
Exactly.
It means patiently teaching someone how to actually live out everything we've talked about today, how to view their wealth as a stewardship rather than an idol, how to forgive 70 times 7, how to flip the power dynamics in their home to become a servant, how to love their enemies, how to walk through their own Gethsemane moments of suffering with honest surrender.
You cannot mass-produce disciples. It requires deep, authentic relationship. It requires exactly what Jesus modeled with these very men for 3 years. He is handing the baton to them, telling them to replicate the process.
And he doesn't leave them with this impossible, crushing weight of a global mission without a guarantee. He ends the entire gospel. He ends this incredible narrative arc with a promise. He says, "And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age."
It is the ultimate comfort, closing the loop on the very beginning of Matthew's gospel. In chapter 1, Jesus is introduced as Emmanuel, which translates to God with us.
And here, in the final breath of the book, he reassures them of that ongoing reality.
The physical incarnation may be ascending, but his spiritual presence, his power, and his fellowship will sustain them through the persecutions, the doubts, and the centuries of history yet to unfold. They are not walking into the future alone.
As we wrap up this massive deep dive, looking at everything from the upending of societal norms to the tearing of the temple veil, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Right.
We spend so much of our lives fearing the end of the age, whether that's our anxiety about global catastrophes, the end of a cherished career, the collapse of a relationship, or just the end of a personal era we desperately wanted to hold on to. But what if the end isn't a cliff we fall off? What if the end is simply the moment we finally realize the teacher has been walking beside us the entire time?
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.